I've been sheriff of Gravel Crossing for 31 years, and in that time I've seen men hang, floods take houses, and cattle barons rise and fall like seasons. I've kept records on most of it, because a man in my line of work learns early that memory is a liar and a ledger is not. But there is one morning I have never needed to write down, because it is the sort of morning that burns itself into a man's eyes and stays there. It began with Nora Teal. If you had asked anyone in Gravel Crossing about Nora Teal in those years before Holt Crane rode back, you would have gotten a shrug, maybe a thin smile. The seamstress, they'd have said. The laundry woman. Plain. Keeps to herself. Never married. They said it the way you talk about a fence post, something that was there, something useful, something you stopped actually seeing a long time ago. She had a narrow shop on the west side of Cord Street, a room in the back where she slept, and a cedar chest under her cot. She had taken in mending since she was 22 years old. She could let a seaman or out with her eyes half shut, and she could read the wear on a man's collar and tell you more about his year than he'd likely care to share. She kept her prices fair and her opinions quiet, and she had never, in all those years, asked a soul in Gravel Crossing for a thing she hadn't earned. But I had watched her long enough to know what the town had missed. Nora Teal was not plain. She was contained, there is a difference, and the men and women of Gravel Crossing had mistaken her stillness for smallness for so long they'd stopped looking close enough to know better. She had dark eyes that held on to things. She had a habit of pausing before she spoke, as though she were weighing every word on a scale only she could read. And she had, for 25 years, kept a secret that would have made most people in town feel about 2 inches tall if they'd known it. 25 years before the morning I am telling you about, a young rancher named Holt Crane had come through Gravel Crossing on his way north to settle a land dispute on his family's old grazing range. He wasn't wealthy in those days. He had a horse, a bedroll, a good rifle, and a stubbornness that came off him like heat off a stovepipe. He was in town 4 days. In those 4 days he had his saddle restitched by Nora Teal. I don't know everything that passed between them in those 4 days. I know she restitched his saddle. I know he came back to her shop more than once, though the stitching would have been finished by the second visit. I know that on the morning he rode out, before the sun was fully up, he stepped into her shop and he handed her a package. It was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with 2 loops of twine, and it was about the size of a man's boot. He said, "Keep this safe. I'll be back for it." She said, "All right." He rode north. And Nora Teal, who had no reason in the world to believe he was anything more than a passing stranger with a tidy saddle, put that package in her cedar chest and kept it there for 25 years. She didn't open it. I know this because I asked her once, years later, how she had managed not to, and she looked at me with those dark holding eyes and said, "He asked me to keep it safe, Amos. Not to inspect it." The town did not know about the package. The town knew only that Nora Teal was the seamstress on Cord Street, past 40 now, past her prime by their generous accounting, and that she would darn your socks and hem your wife's Sunday dress and not charge you a cent more than she'd quoted. A few of the cattlemen's wives had made their remarks over the years. "Such a shame," they would say, lowering their voices in that way women do when they don't actually feel the shame they're performing. She might have married, if she'd had more to recommend her. I heard it more than once. It never seemed to reach Nora, or if it did, she never let it bend her. She just kept the package. The morning Holt Crane rode back into Gravel Crossing, I was standing outside my office with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, watching the East Road the way I'd done every morning for 3 decades. I saw a rider come in at a walk, not a young man's walk, the kind that wants to be seen, but an old man's walk, the kind that has given up wanting things and settled for arriving. He was weathered down to the grain. Big hands on the reins. A hat that had seen more weather than most roofs in this county. He came straight down Cord Street, and he did not stop at the hotel and he did not stop at the saloon. He stopped in front of Nora Teal's seamstress shop, and he got down from his horse with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees have opinions, and he knocked. I set my coffee down. Inside, I learned later, Nora had looked up from her work table, seen him through the glass, and felt something move in her chest that she had kept very still for a long time. She went to the door. She opened it. She looked at him for a moment, older, trail-worn, the years written plainly across his face, and she said, "Mr. Crane." Not a question. Not a cry. Just his name, the way you say the name of something you have been expecting without knowing quite when it would arrive. He said, "Miss Teal. I've come for the package." She said, "I know. Come in." She brought him to her front room, the one with 2 chairs and the good window light, and she went to the back. He stood and waited. I imagine he stood very still, the way a man stands when he has traveled a long distance toward a thing and has suddenly arrived at it and is no longer certain his legs know what to do. I imagine he looked at his hands. He'd had 25 years to rehearse whatever he meant to say, and I have a feeling that standing in Nora Teal's front room, with the smell of her work, clean linen and beeswax and the faint iron bite of a pressing cloth, around him, every word he'd practiced went quiet on him. She came back with the package in both arms, still wrapped in the same oilcloth, still tied with 2 loops of twine, 25 years older and not 1 inch damaged, and she set it on the table between the 2 chairs and she sat down. He sat across from her. He looked at the package for a long moment. Then he untied the twine, folded it back the oilcloth, and laid out what was inside. There were 2 items. The first was a letter, folded small, addressed in a hand that had been younger when it was written. The second was a land deed, filed with the Territorial Office 25 years prior, for 80 acres north of Gravel Crossing on the Creek Bend, and on that deed, in the name of the owner, were 2 names. Holt J. Crane. And Nora E. Teal. He had filed it before he left. Before he knew whether she would wait. Before he had found the words to ask. He picked up the letter and he held it out to her without reading it himself, because he already knew what it said. She took it and she read it, and whatever was in it I have never asked and she has never told me, and that is as it should be. When she finished she set it down on her knee and she looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them spoke for what I am told was a very long time. Then Holt Crane said, "I meant to come back sooner. The land dispute turned into 3 disputes, and then my father took sick, and then I had a ranch to run that was barely alive, and the years," he stopped. He looked at the deed on the table. "The years didn't stop just because I wasn't paying attention to them." Nora said, "No. They don't. I filed that deed because I was going to come back and ask you properly. I was going to come back in the spring." He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm sorry it took me until now." She looked at him for a moment in that weighing way of hers. Then she said, "The offer on that deed, does it still stand?" He went very still. "I came a long way to make sure it did." "Then yes," said Nora Teal. "It stands on my end too." Now. I did not hear this conversation as it happened. I heard it from Nora herself, some weeks later, told quietly and without decoration. But I did see what happened next, because I had drifted across Cord Street by that point, slowly, the way a man does when he's pretending he has business somewhere, and I was standing near enough to the window to see, when the door of Nora Teal's seamstress shop opened, 2 people walk out. Holt Crane had the deed rolled and tucked inside his coat. Nora had her good shawl on, the gray wool one she kept for Sundays. He held the door for her, and then he stood beside her on the step, and the 2 of them looked up the street with the composed expression of people who have made a decision and are at peace with it. I want to tell you the town of Gravel Crossing witnessed this scene with the grace it deserved. I want to, but I am a sheriff and I keep accurate records. What happened was that Mrs. Hadley Frome, who had said such a shame about Nora Teal more times than I could count, stopped dead on the boardwalk with a bolt of calico under her arm and stared. And her husband Bert, coming out of the hardware behind her, walked into her back and nearly put them both through the window. And young Clem Adder, who worked the livery, came out to see what the fuss was and stood with his mouth open like a man who has seen something he will be talking about for the rest of his natural life. None of them said a word. What was there to say? Holt Crane brought his horse around from the rail. Nora went back inside, came out with a carpetbag. She had packed it, I realized, before he came to the door. She had been ready for whatever the package held, and he helped her up with the quiet practicality of a man who had been a long time getting to this particular moment and intended to waste no more of it. They rode north together, up Cord Street and out the east end of town, toward the 80 acres on the creek bend where a deed had been waiting for 25 years to be lived upon. I watched them go until they cleared the ridge, and I stood there a little longer after, holding my cold coffee and feeling the particular satisfaction of a man who has been right about something for a long time and has finally been proven so. The thing about Gravel Crossing, in the years that followed, was that people stopped referring to Nora Teal as plain. Not because she had changed, she had not. She was the same woman she had always been, contained and still and precise, with those dark eyes that held on to things. She and Holt built a good life on that creek bend property. He ran cattle on the north pasture, she took in mending from the neighboring ranches and eventually taught the Birch girls to sew well enough to earn their own living. On Sunday mornings in summer you could sometimes see them on the porch together before the heat came up, him with his coffee and his newspaper, her with whatever she was working, not talking much, the way people don't talk when they have run out of things to prove to each other. The town had called her plain for a quarter of a century. What they had missed was this: she had simply been waiting for a question that took 25 years to arrive, and she had kept the faith on it without complaint or spectacle or a single word to anyone. That is not a plain thing. That is the rarest kind of strength there is. I am an old man now, and I have kept records of most everything I have seen in Gravel Crossing, but I never wrote the morning of Holt Crane's return down in any ledger. I didn't need to. Some things a man carries in a place that doesn't require ink. What I know is this: he left a package with her and she kept it safe, exactly as he'd asked. And when he came back for it, she was still there, not diminished by the waiting, not hardened by it, just steady, the way good ground stays good even when nothing is planted in it. He had filed her name on a deed 25 years before he could ask her to claim it, because he had known from 4 days and a stitched saddle what the rest of the town had never bothered to look close enough to see. That is the whole story. I have told it plain, because plain is what it was, and plain is what it deserved.